It's
the
Jamming
Fanzine podcast. I mean, the thing about a fanzine was holding it in your hand, right? And looking at the way it'd been put together and the punk way it'd been put together, quite frankly. And it had a staple in it, you know, and that is a fanzine, right?
Episode 8, Trails from the Trenches.
Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of the Jamming Fanzine podcast of the year 2022. If you're a regular listener, you may have been wondering where we got to the last couple of weeks. Well, yes, we took 2 weeks off for the holidays, and hopefully you did as well. But we are back. This is the Jamming Fanzine podcast, and as the name suggests, it's a podcast about a fanzine called Jamming. But it's much, much more than that. It's always intended to be a podcast about fanzines in general, even if we're talking about a particular publication during a particular period of time. That would be the fanzine Jamming, of which I, Tony Fletcher, was the editor and publisher from 1977 to 86, and of which a book has just been published compiling the best of Jamming. And to that end, ever since publishing this book, and indeed beforehand as well, it's been very evident to me that there is some form of resurgence of both interest in the fanzines of that post-punk heyday. I'm aware of other people putting together similar books to the best of Jamming about their own fanzines, or perhaps about their own city's multitude of fanzines. I'm also aware that there are often books published. There's quite a library I'm gathering right now of books about fanzines in general. And I'm aware of lots of people putting out their own small press publications. And that for just about everybody who is doing this, there's an understanding that a book, a fanzine, a little mimeographed A5 fold together, give it to your friend zine, means so much more when it's a tactile object than it does when it's just online. So we are kind of willing to keep this podcast going and widen the show's remit, but only if you want us to. So we want to hear from you. We want you to take the time out to look for our social media, which you will find in the show notes of this podcast. We want you to take the time out, please, to go to one of the podcast platforms and leave a rating and or a review. Find some way to let us know that you want us to keep this going, and we will kind of, have a look and make our own decision in the next few weeks. It's certainly been a success up to now. It's had some great listening figures, but I don't want to deny it's a fair bit of work, and nobody's getting anything for it except the love. And beyond the love, there is also the joy of reuniting with people. This episode is an absolute perfect example of it. I got 3 of Jamming's most prolific former contributors together. They are Bruce Dessau, Ross Fortune, and Paul Davies. And it was the first time the 4 of us had actually ever been in a room together, even a Zoom room. And that's partly because Paul and Ross did not live in London back in the day, so they were not in the Jamming office too often. It's perhaps indicative of just how much work at least one of them put in such a short space of time, that you'll hear Bruce Dessau right at the beginning of this interview say he contributed to Jamming for 5 years. And actually it was just 1984 and 1985, but that was the period we put out the most words, the most issues in the shortest space of time. It's a fun conversation, or I think it's fun. You will hear lots of anecdotes. You will hear a lot about the very blurred lines between the interviewer and interviewee, which I think was a good thing. You'll hear certainly some stories of alcohol being involved, and you're going to hear anecdotes about the likes of Joe Strummer and Mick Jones and the Jesus and Mary chain and Robert Smith and Pauline Black and all kinds of other people. I hope you have fun with it. I will be back at the end to clear up any loose ends and also to give you the information on 3 book events taking place in the UK in late February, which I'm really excited about. But for now, I want to leave you with the conversation. And yes, it's been edited a little bit, and so if you hear the odd equivalent of a Tipex or glue mark, so what? It's a fanzine podcast. Episode 8, Tales from the Trenches.
Do you want to buy a copy of Jamming?
So let's go around the metaphorical table and introduce ourselves. And I have a feeling, Bruce, that you and I have known each other the longest.
I've known you through Jamming. I know that some people you've spoken to before you were at school with. I know you from jamming from probably either autumn 83 or early 84. That's around the time that I got to know you and started writing. And I think I must have written for jamming for about 5 years. Very exciting times indeed. Oh, and I'm Bruce Dessau, if I haven't said my name.
I'm Ross Fortune. I wrote for jamming from issue 16 through 31, I think. It got me started in music journalism. I worked at Time Out for 15 years where I was music editor. In 2004, I moved to America, and I now own a music venue bar in Texas, just south of Austin.
I'm Paul Davies. I wrote for jamming, similar to Ross, really, issues 17 to 32. So I started towards the tail end of 83 and was there pretty much till the end, I guess. But I've always wanted to write about music and went through the whole fanzine thing like Tony did, and then tried to kind of break into music journalism. And I don't quite remember how I got jamming's contacts, but I just hunted off some speculative reviews. And Tony was good enough to give some positive feedback, published a few. And before I knew it, I was on the train to London interviewing Tony Parsons, which was just great for me.
Yeah, and I just read that piece actually just a few minutes ago. Bruce, you wrote in the book about, and it's funny because the moment you mentioned this, it all came back to me. But if I had been asked how I met you, I would have just assumed you probably came into jamming. But actually, you'd been round to my house before that, I think.
Yeah, I think it was just mutual friends or even possibly mutual girlfriends, I'm not sure. But I'd been to a gig, I was living in South London myself at the time, and I'd been to a show, and I think one afternoon, a gig in a park in South London. I think after the show, the person I was with said, they knew you and said, let's pop over and see Tony Fletcher. And I knew exactly who you were. You know, I knew jamming, I knew your band as well. I think it was about 6 months later that I contacted. I sort of had the idea. I just left college and I didn't really know what I was going to do. There weren't many jobs around then. I contacted you sort of out of the blue, really, and just said, I'd really love to write for jamming. And you were really supportive. I think that was the thing about the magazine that I remember. I like to think that you saw that I had something, that I had enthusiasm for the subject. And, and you were very supportive and enthusiastic about getting those kind of people onto the magazine. So it's a sort of mutual thing that worked out for both of us, I hope. I'm still a journalist now. And, it really all started with jamming.
Yeah, and you write, you have this great memory that you write about in the book. Do you mind recapping it about me? Actually, you came to see me and then I gave you more or less a lift home, I guess.
I came up for a meeting with you and, I didn't have a file of cut-ins. I didn't have things I'd written somewhere else I could show you and say, I don't even think I submitted a sort of sample review or anything. I just came and said, look, I love the magazine. I love music. I really want to write. I think we also talked maybe about writing about film. And you kind of just went, yeah, it was almost like that, when can you start type of thing. And I said to you something like, by the way, Tony, how do you know I can even write? You've never seen anything I've written. And I think you said something like, your enthusiasm, you obviously know the subject and you love music. I'm sure you can do it. And that's what I mean. You were just so supportive of me. I think I went and bought a second-hand typewriter that week and got on with it.
Ross, what was your foundation? Paul had been doing a fanzine. Where did you grow up and how did you approach jamming? I'd like to ask both Ross and Paul, why approach jamming? Did you approach other magazines? Ross, would you go first on that?
I did a fanzine in Manchester called Only Heroes, which went to 2 issues, the second of which wasn't published. And then I moved to Liverpool. And I can't remember how I got in touch. I really can't. It's funny, I sat down last night and I got all my old jamming magazines out, and I got some 80s vinyl and a glass of wine, and I sat down and I got issue 16, and my name's on the masthead as a contributor. I couldn't find anything in it, and I went to 17 and there's nothing in it, 18 and there's nothing in it. And then I realized that I must at some point in time have torn out all the pages that had my stuff on. And over the years, I've kept these copies of the magazine, and I have no idea where my pieces are.
But I do want to ask Paul and Ross, both of you, was writing for jamming any more important than writing for anything else?
Well, for me, I'd been trying to kind of get stuff published all over the place in the usual way, letters to Sounds Enemy, Melody Maker, and sending off long handwritten reviews to the live reviews desk and not getting that far. So to then get something sent to you and get some positive feedback on it and get published, that was like getting a foothold, because it was something that I always wanted to do, was write about music. And even when I was like 16, I remember I bought this book from the back of the NME called An Introduction to Rock Journalism. It's got some absolute pearls in it. So I might scan that into sometime, get it and send it to you. But that was great. And then after school, I sort of went to university, flunked out after a couple of months, and it's like punk was happening and everything was going on. So we started a fanzine, a bunch of friends, and I just so happened to have one of the copies here. Oh, Cardiff, up yours. Seminal thing.
Fantastic. Thin Lizzy and the Sex Pistols. I don't feel half so bad about having Thin Lizzy and jamming.
Yeah, it was, to me, it was like bands like the Thin Lizzy were kind of as important as the Clash, because we used to follow them around, and like the Clash did, they would let people in. We didn't have tickets after the time. We'd follow them off around the country and they would just let us in. We got to know them. So, I wasn't just like starting again from the Pistols and the Clash. It was some of that stuff. And then when we did our first fanzine, then obviously some of that stuff kind of crept in, so hence Phil Lynott on the cover with the Pistols. But that was like, for me, that we did the fanzine, we did 2 issues of that. But I always wanted to kind of pursue it as I don't know, not career. I don't suppose you'd call it career, but just do it more seriously. And jamming gave me a foothold, and I look back on it, as I said to you before, Tony, with great fondness. It had the ethos of a fanzine, but it had kind of a loftier ambition. It was like a great magazine, and I think in many ways a precursor of a lot of magazines that followed it in the monthly press. If it hadn't been for magazines like Jammin', I don't think Q magazine would have been the same type of thing. I mean, they were kind of a bit more grown up, if you like. But I loved the fact that the enthusiasm of the contributors just ran through Jammin' like a seam, primarily we loved music and we loved those bands, and we were trying to capture that passion. Really, I think that's what set it apart.
Yeah, one thing that I'm getting from all of us straight away is that wanting to be a music journalist back in the early 80s was of any kind, whether it was doing your own fanzine, writing for Jamming, or wanting to write for the NME, it was a pretty noble job. It was a decent thing to aspire towards. I noticed that it kind of all came together. Actually, Ross, it is quite funny. Issue 17, you had a lovely piece on Pauline Black, and I'm still kicking myself for not putting her name on the cover. I think that was your first substantial piece for us. But issue 19 is a pretty good issue, and all 3 of you have something relatively substantial in there. In fact, Ross, you have that big center page interview with Joe Strummer, which is in the book, and you have a big piece on Mike Scott, who himself wrote a little piece for the book. Bruce, you have what looks like your first full page on the cinema, which then became a regular column. And Paul, that's the issue that you have Tony Parsons, your Tony Parsons interview, which I think is your first piece. So there is this moment somewhere in the spring of 1984 where the 3 of you are part of like the bedrock of what was for Jamming was a really great year in terms of what we put out, and you're all kind of finding your place there. And particularly for you, Bruce, you come at this from a slightly different angle, because you talked about writing about the movies. And I think I said, yeah, I was hoping somebody would do that. And you were ready to do a column. So that became something that you had in addition to other people. You took that very seriously. I'm looking, and you put in substantial movie reviews in a 1-page article every single month or every single other month for quite a while.
Yeah, well, it took a bit of organising, but it was nice to get to films and get to see, again, my first experience as a journalist, going to previews, getting free sandwiches in Wardour Street, was all part of the fun. And, you just, again, it's just a very parallel thing to the music thing. I loved cinema. As you say, I think that was what I mentioned to you the first time we met. And so I wanted to see all the films. I mean, one of the interesting things about that, I'm not sure when the piece appeared, but I suggested we do an interview with Barry Norman. And it reminded me of, I was thinking about this the other night, how different the whole machinery of public relations work. I got the interview with Barry Norman by literally getting the BBC TV Centre phone number out of the phone directory, if you can remember the big phone directories, got the BBC number out, said, can I speak to Barry Norman, please? They put me through to the Film 84 offices. Someone said, oh, sorry, Barry's working from home today. Here's his home phone number. Gave me Barry Norman's home phone number. I rang him up and he was very courteous, very kind, gave me his time, and we set the interview up. So, yeah, I mean, doing the film stuff was a sort of nice string to my bow, nice thing to do. And I think also, yeah, from the point of jamming, I guess you like the fact that it kind of, film was as, you know, a part of popular culture, that the kind of people that were interested in the kind of music in the magazine would also be interested in films.
I always wanted us to have a wide remit, and everybody came to us saying, can I interview Morrissey, I guess, you know, or Weller, something like that. Everybody would love to have had that gig. But I always wanted us to have books. I wanted us to have just, you know, maybe a poetry column and have a film column, and never shy away from the political articles, to be able to write about people that were in sports, in movies, on TV, and just be more of a culture magazine. You know, talking of that access and the ease of access, I mean, that's a great entry point for what I thought would be a really, you know, good sort of meat of this conversation, to ask you about your most memorable interviews and maybe about the way that they were conducted, because that same issue of jamming that the three of you came together, your cover story, actually, so here's the thing, it wasn't the cover story. We put Frankie on the cover. And maybe partly because the Clash didn't have an album out at the time and nobody was quite sure what was going to come next. But I read your interview with Strummer word for word today. It's a good one, Ross. What do you remember about that encounter? You write something about it for the book. Can you take us through that a bit?
I just remember being naive, enthusiastic, passionate, and stupid. And like Bruce says, the ease of access was kind of phenomenal. I think I found CBS got through to the press office. They fobbed me off with Cosmo Vinyl's number, who was managing the band at the time, and I just phoned him every day. But I never told you. I never told Jamming. And for 3-4 weeks, I just pursued this until finally they Cosmo relented and arranged an interview before a gig at the Brixton Academy. And I just showed up, and it was just me and Strummer in the dressing room. And he was magnificent.
You did a good job of taking Joe to task while clearly still revering him, which I think is the balance that we often try to strike. I do want to reference, though, you in the book you mentioned, I mean, take us through it, because you talk about your nerves caused you to commit a classic rookie faux pas, correct?
I mean, it was just me and Strummer in the dressing room, and there was this big galvanized tub full of beer and Coke and I think bottles of water. And Strummer just sort of said, help yourself. And he wasn't drinking. And like I said, I was in there for like an hour, and I kept reaching in, getting beer after beer after beer. And then finally the rest of the band started to traipse in, and the interview kind of wound up. And I thought I'll just have one last beer. And I reached in, and I was trawling through. My hands were kind of numb with the ice. And there was no more beer left. And I drunk the Clash's beer. I think as I write in the book, that was a badge I wore proudly for a while.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one to have. I can understand, actually, with the nerves from that. And nobody said anything, I hope, or did they?
I was out the door before they probably realised.
And Bruce, just you were mentioning about Barry Norman. Do you recall that being maybe the first major interview you did?
Oh, possibly. Maybe we did that to sort of launch the sort of film column. But I did loads of great interviews. I mean, it's the thing about Joe Strummer. I mean, I think I actually wrote. I think I wrote one piece for you that won't be in the book, because I don't think you ran it. And it's that question of never meet your heroes. And I think most of the people I met through jamming, I think, were fantastic. You know, I think most of them lived up to expectations. And sadly, I think the only one that didn't was Mick Jones. And I interviewed him around, obviously, for Big Audio Dynamite after, well, probably not long after Ross, but that era. Again, talking about the access thing, what was great about it was we did the interview in his flat in Notting Hill. So it wasn't in a record company office. It was, I think, Magenta Divine was his manager at the time, or his publicist. And they just gave me the address and I went round to the flat. And I think he might have smoked something before, I think it's fair to say. He was just very giggly. I didn't get a lot of sense out of him. And for someone like, same with Strummer, for Mick Jones, someone that was had been so important to me for all those years, I was kind of disappointed. So maybe it was my fault the piece didn't run. Maybe I didn't get enough out of him. Maybe my disillusionment with him. But I think that might have been one piece that didn't run in Jamming.
Yeah, there's always going to be maybe one negative experience. When I've spoken with Mick, he's been great. Interestingly, there was clearly a lot of bad blood still between Joe and Mick in that Clash interview that Ross did. Joe's complaining about the lawyers sending writs every other day. And, you know, they made it up soon enough, and Joe camped out at the BAD's second album studio sessions and slept under the mixing board, I believe, and ended up co-producing it. But what about the more memorable encounters? If for you, Paul, your first major piece for us was Tony Parsons, you know, he's an interesting one because he was a writer who had become something of an icon.
Tony Parsons was great. He met us off the train, took us into the Pride of Paddington pub, and we just sat there all afternoon chatting, really. He kept on buying us drinks. We got onto the vodkas and cokes at the end of the afternoon. So, that was a great one for me, to be honest. Very good.
Let's go around. Ross, you did a lot of interviews for us. Some major names, some less major names. Can you relive any of them for us in terms of, you know, particularly memorable people or memorable encounters, or indeed disappointments that you may have had?
I mean, Strummer was the most memorable in a positive sense. In a less positive sense, Gil Scott Heron, who I was a big admirer of, and I interviewed him backstage after a show at the Liverpool Empire, and he was high and he was drunk and he was an asshole. But what was weird about it was he was an asshole to me for about half an hour during the interview, which is fine because I was this spiky-haired little white kid asking him questions about socio-political import in the black community in America or whatever. But after the interview wound up, fans who had gathered in the corridor outside the dressing room were allowed in to meet him and to get autographs. And he started to kind of treat me as his kind of buddy, and he'd make these really snide asides about his fans and put them down. And it was suddenly as if the two of us were really close, and we were patronizing towards the fans, and it just kind of felt really uncomfortable. And at that time, I'd never heard about him having kind of addictions or anything like that. You just heard songs, The Bottle or Angel Dust or whatever, kind of articulately warning of the dangers of alcohol and drugs. And years later, it kind of came out that he did have this addiction problem. And without being nasty, that I felt that kind of validated my piece, because I'd never seen anyone else criticize him or highlight that before. So that was my most disappointing. And then there was an interview that never happened with Morrissey, which highlights how long ago it was. Because I was living in a flat in Liverpool. I had a telephone, which not all my friends did. I didn't have an answer machine. And it later transpired that Jamming had been trying to contact me to see if I'd interview Morrissey while I was in Liverpool. And I never got the phone calls, no answer machine, never got the message. So I went downstairs one day to get the mail, and there was a postcard from Jamming saying, "Will you interview Morrissey at 11 o'clock at the Adelphi Hotel?" And it was that day, and it was like 10:30. So I threw a tape recorder in my bag and a notebook, and I lived about 10 minutes away from the city centre, so I kind of stormed off down there. And I got there just as John Wilde was starting the interview, and he'd come up on the train that day. But it's crazy to think that the communication was just so archaic.
Thank you for sharing that memory, because that was how things were. And with the relation to Gil Scott Heron, I mean, there's a couple of things there. Number one, without an internet, there was less room for gossip. So somebody could write a song about the bottle and you wouldn't necessarily know that they were, still having their own problems or having problems with other substances. It would often only come out through interviews where people were very coy. Like a journalist might, only a Tony Parsons would really be brave enough to say this person was doing this in front of me. You would just have to insinuate that there were problems with this person, because we had the music press, but we weren't sharing gossip across any other kind of platform. I think there is something that you alluded to there, which is, we're coming from one cultural background, and it's great when we're interviewing the Morrisseys and the Robert Smiths of this world. But when we're interviewing people who come from a completely different cultural background, very often the interview part it's not important to them. It's not how they communicate. And I learned that when I moved to America, and with a lot of hip hop artists, a lot of rappers I interviewed, and even within the soul music field, which I love, and the people are so friendly. The interview process has never been like, let's sit down for a long interview. That's not how they communicate. So I think that, you caught Gil Scott Heron at the end of a bad night at a bad time in his life. And, if that's the only person that you met that was a disappointment, I guess that's still a good batting average, right? Paul, you had a couple of cover stories for us, at least a couple, and you wrote, one of them was Robert Smith, who I was really glad we got in jamming, because we didn't do enough around that area, really, and I'm really pleased that we did. But you actually wrote, I'm going to quote here, that arranging an interview with Robert Smith, that it would have been marginally easier organising a round of golf with the Pontiff.
Yeah, I do remember that was the tricky one. And on the day itself, we were meeting in, I think it was some photographic studio in South London or something. And because Robert was doing this extended photo session, he was literally keeping me waiting for hours. And I was just thinking, I'm going to miss my train here. And there was a frantic press officer who was running around and then asking me if I wanted some beer from the off license and all this kind of stuff. So it was a bit crazy before the interview. I mean, he was fine. He was good to interview. I would kind of sort of took issue with him a little bit, because I was kind of one of those naive young people who were expecting a lot from the artists that I was talking to, So when he started going on about politics and being an SDP voter and Labour and the Tories are all the same, I was just glazing over and thinking, oh my God. But then again, should we expect that kind of political insight from a band who clearly have got no axe to grind politically? They're just making pretty incredible music, So, I mean, that was a good one. Something sort of related to what Ross was saying, when I interviewed John Cooper Clarke in Cardiff, that was a good one. And it was like a continuum in a way, because it was the first review I got published, and then one of the first interviews as well. And so he was performing in Cardiff, my home city, which was great. And he was doing a co-headlining tour with Nico at the time. And Nico was his partner at the time. And, it's the ultimate chemical romance, apparently. But I was 24 years old and completely naive about this. I didn't know what the hell was going on. And he was great company, and, he was very accommodating, but he was incredibly edgy and in the dressing room. And he was constantly asking his manager if this package had arrived at Cardiff Central Station. And I'm thinking, what could this package possibly be, And then only literally years later, it clicked that, that's what the package was. But it was just quite funny in retrospect, looking back on it, how naive I was. And but he was fine. He was good company, and got some good quotes out of him. He was good.
The naivety played into our favor a lot of times. And there was a really interesting review got published just a couple of days ago of the book, and the guy clearly read the book almost cover to cover, and he was sort of saying, worthy may sound like a negative word. That's really what he used, the word worthy. But he was saying that, back then, that was actually a relatively noble goal. If your alternatives were Julie Burchill with a Communist Manifesto, or the other hipsters trying to tell you how damn hip they were, there was a certain worthiness and earnestness to jamming's interviews, which could flip both ways as a criticism or a compliment. But one thing I'm very aware of, we all tended to take our interviewees or hold their feet to the fire. And we did have this political edge to jamming, and it came into your film reviews as well, Bruce. Maybe not so much the artists that you interviewed, but we did kind of expect our interviewees to have something to say about the state of the world. And the state of the world was Thatcher and Reagan. And so interviewing a Robert Smith, or indeed you interviewed Kurt Smith from Tears for Fears for us, Paul, and just because they were pop groups to some degree, and the Cure a pop group as much as a goth group, didn't mean that you didn't want to ask them those questions. And I think we went to everybody and really asked them to sort of justify their place in the world. And if that was naivety and earnestness and worthiness, it's not a bad quality to have, I would say. What do the rest of you think about that?
I think that's right, yeah. And one of the people I interviewed, who's actually a completely lovely bloke, Mike Peters, looking back, because like most of us, I'm probably going back through some of those old interviews, and I was thinking, what a hard time I gave the poor guy, And
you were really aggressive, really aggressive.
I know. I don't know what I was thinking of, but I mean, he was such a lovely guy. And I've met him several times since, and he's always been so nice, And but I think I was kind of in that mindset that I wanted everybody to be Strummer or Weller or Christine of the Redskins, And as much as I did like the alarm a lot, but there was a kind of, they felt like a kind of bit of an impersonation in some ways. So, yeah, but he was great. He was, he didn't get aggrieved about it. He was just trying to explain himself and what the band are trying to do, and that was fine.
Yeah, and I think it was maybe a fanzine ethic that held through the magazine days. A lot of these pieces that we're talking about, if they're not question and answer, what I love about the Robert Smith interview, Paul, is after your intro, it's all Robert in his own words until you wrap it up. Your Clash interview is a Q&A, Ross, a couple of your other pieces. And I think it's, that was something that we had over the mainstream music press for the most part, was that we kind of wanted, we would either question and answer and you could see what we were asking them, or we would just try and summarize in between their quotes. We would really be trying to let the artists speak for themselves, even if we were holding their feet to the fire. Bruce, would that speak true of the kind of interviews you did for us? You interviewed Roddy Frame is a good example, maybe.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. We weren't, I think we're all of the same generation. We were politicized, by punk, as you said, whether it was the Clash or the Jam or Paul Weller and Strummer. These are the people that we've grown up with. So when we did the interviews, obviously we talked to the people about politics. I remember that Roddy Frame interview well. I mean, again, another great thing about you was we sort of graduated through jamming, through smaller pieces to larger pieces. And I think that's the camera one was the first big piece I did. And yeah, Roddy was a very articulate person. I mean, that's the thing. And we weren't cynical. I don't think, that's the thing. Maybe some of the NME sort of era, NME journalists were more cynical. I think we weren't trying to stitch people up. We were fans, but we also were prepared to sort of push them and ask them questions. And if they were articulate enough, I think Roddy was, how he was younger than us, wasn't he? He was so young and so articulate and so clever and so passionate. I have to say, just as a sidebar though, the thing I remember the most about being given the chance to do a big interview, and again, how times have changed. I think that Roddy Frame, maybe I had 90 minutes with him at the Warner Brothers office, and it was a 90-minute interview, and on a manual typewriter. The worst part of being a journalist was interviewing people with jamming, was transcribing the interviews. It took for hours and hours to transcribe, because he had so much to say. It took hours and hours to transcribe that interview. And I have to say, I'm glad the technology, we were talking about communication earlier, that transcribing technology has come on, and you can do that sort of using apps and whatever. But, Roddy Frame, every word he said was important.
And it's a long feature. We packed a lot of words into the 3 pages you had with Roddy, because like you say, he's articulate. And I loved him, and glad that you were able to work up to those pieces. We've already mentioned a couple of times, it's come into play here, that it was very common to drink with the bands. And I think we grew up in a very, very boozy Britain. It's still pretty boozy, but you wouldn't, more likely to get carded if you're a teenager these days. But we grew up in a very boozy environment. Bruce, you wrote for the book about your memories of emptying a minibar, or being allowed into the minibar with, who was it again?
Yeah, I was slightly when I reflected on what I'd written for you, and I think you might have cut it down a bit in the end, and I'm grateful for that. A lot of my anecdotes seem to be based around alcohol. It was either backstage or, as you say, like a bit like Ross's interview with Joe Strummer. You'd be interviewing someone in the record company offices, and as a young kid without having much access to money, the press officer would open the fridge and there'd be kind of bottles of booze, spirits, whatever. The nice thing about the job was, on the one hand, you had piles of records, and the publicist would say, help yourself to the records you like. On the other side, you'd have the alcohol. And I think it was the culture then. I think, within certain limits, but on the road as well. I mean, certainly, again, like Ross, if you're with a band backstage, you kind of, you got to see the riders that bands had, and, you were invited, you were, it was all part of what you were doing. And and also because you could get that close relationship. Same way, you're saying like the Clash or the band, Thin Lizzy would let you in backstage and let fans in. As a journalist, you seem to be allowed to be backstage with bands. There wasn't any of a publicist sort of shutting the band away and keeping the band away from the journalists, which again gave you good stories and good access. I mean, it's a shame they don't do that now. I think journalists would get much better stories if they had the same access.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think the band, sometimes there was almost like I don't know if it was a test. I don't think it was as conscious as that. But I think that if you could last an evening drinking with them, you somehow did pass the test. You were on the inside. They often wanted you to be with them. I think it was a lot harder to sort of be standoffish, which, we did have a couple of writers that were good at being able to keep that distance. But I genuinely think that was part of the culture, and it was expected at times of us. You also, Bruce, carved out a little, not a complete niche entirely for yourself, but you followed a certain strand of music. And just looking at the back issues, whereas Ross and Paul were sent off to interview some of the cover stars and some big names, you got into that very sort of spiky pop, didn't you?
Yeah, sort of, I suppose, shambling, as John Peel, the shambling scene. It's funny, that was the Creation scene, I suppose, wasn't it? Creation Records, is that what you're thinking of?
It was Creation, but there were other groups besides, because what was it you wrote here? You wrote that you got into groups that had a scruffy punk spirit, but a more accessible pop sensibility. So whether it was the June Brides or you wrote about Micro Disney, Big Beat Records. There was a lot of stuff that you wrote about, and that was very, very much going on. That it wasn't just Creation; there were other labels out there that were releasing that kind of music, and it was a happening thing in 84, 85, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, those are the gigs. Again, it's nice to be given the opportunity. Again, I guess it's those words that we sort of come back to. Enthusiasm and passion, and those are the gigs. I was going to the big gigs as well. The Brixton Academy or the Apollo or Hammersmith Odeon, wasn't it in those days? Not the Apollo, it was Hammersmith Odeon. But it was those small gigs, the Polytechnic of Central London or the Clarendon in Hammersmith, or those small clubs that you go to gigs, 2 or 3 times a week. And those are the bands, those rough trade bands as well that were breaking through. Again, it's weird thinking about the communication thing again. I don't even know how I knew about half of those gigs. I mean, it must have been, obviously, there were listings in the NME, but sometimes what would happen is you'd go to one gig, and at the gig, a pub in Islington or something, you'd get a flyer for where the band was playing the following week, and you'd find out about it there. Or I was lucky. I did have a very early, a huge answer phone. I mean, my answer phone was the size of an old-fashioned Apple Mac. And you get in the evening, you get messages of where things were happening, and you'd follow them through that. But that was a very exciting scene. I guess it became known as C86 as well, but the C86 scene. But the Primal Scream, and I got to go on tour with the Jesus and Mary chain around Europe. I mean, that was exciting. I'm not even sure if I wrote a piece about it, but Alan McGee, who I'd seen, met very early on at one of these gigs in Tottenham Court Road, invited me on the road with them, and I think I lasted about 5 days on the road with the Jesus and Mary chain. Although I did very quickly, I'll say, I did get to play with the Jesus and Mary chain, because again, going back to the communication thing, we were travelling in 2 separate VW vans, and the van that William Reid was in, the guitarist, broke down. We had no way of contacting them, so when we got to the gig, someone else had to play guitar, and at one point I ended up picking up the guitar and playing with the Jesus and Mary chain for about 5 minutes. But it was 5 minutes that I've been eating out on ever since.
It also speaks again to that. You go on the road with a band, you're expected to mix with them. Honestly and truly, the boundaries were very, very, very blurred. And they were blurred to the extent that you could actually be a stand-in for the Mary Chain. So you mentioned that in the piece you wrote for the book. I personally don't remember you handing in an article about that. It's possible that you came back and said it's all just like such a blur. But you did go off and do a piece on Creation Records, after which we famously lost all the record sleeves, as I gather.
Oh yeah, that was one. Again, it's there were two things. If I have two regrets about writing for Jamming, one is it taught me to bank the checks quicker, because I think when you had a bit of a financial crisis, my checks all bounced because I hadn't got to the bank and banked them. So it taught me about financial management. And secondly, yeah, I think I probably said in the article, I lent you all the sleeves to do the layout for a piece about Creation Records, and they got lost between the printers and the office. And I said something like, "Oh, don't worry, no one's ever going to want to collect Creation Records. Don't worry about it." And now I've still got the records, but I haven't got the sleeves. So there you go.
Yeah, unfortunately, it happens. If it helps at all, I only found out recently that the Sunday Mirror managed to lose Anthony Blompier's photographs of Paul McCartney. So, at least there are further sleeves around. There are other people who have Creation Records sleeves. But we were doing profiles on the labels, and you did one on Big Beat as well, and we did one on Creation. I think you were like spot on in terms of writing about them. We were writing about the Mary Chain. We were generally on track with the bands that we wrote about at that point. Did either of the other of you have any regrets of any kind? Is there anything that like, if you it's always a fun question. If you went back now, is there anything that you would do different? Anybody that you would handle differently? Or is there any interview that you really wish you had gotten that for some reason didn't come together? Either I wouldn't give you the green light, or we just couldn't make it happen. Ross, you're laughing. Is there something comes to mind?
You arranged for the first Lloyd Cole album to be sent to me to review, which I was looking forward to. And the postman folded it in half to get it through the letterbox.
All right.
So,
had the postman never seen a record before?
I don't know.
That's just brilliant.
So
I mean, I've had a few records arrive broken, but I've never known a postman to fold it. Okay. All right. So you didn't review the album for us, I take it?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Paul, anything that you look back on that like that you would really handle differently, or any particular missed opportunities?
In terms of the interviews I did, I don't think so. I think the approach I took was probably the right one. I did wonder what would have happened if I'd have got that full-timer's job towards the end, but I mean, it probably wouldn't have lasted long. But it was fun to think what direction my life would have gone if I'd have got that. So that was interesting. The thing that struck me when I was going through the book was I don't think many of us really understood how precarious the whole operation was, because from the outside, all I could see was a magazine that seemed to be flourishing and to be getting more attention. And, you'd see it in W.A. Smith's and stuff. And I thought, this is building into something really impressive here. And then we, had no idea that there's the kind of juggling that you were doing in the background. So all respect to you for keeping it afloat for so long, really.
Yeah, and I know, Bruce, we've talked about this a couple of times, because I guess being in London, we stayed in touch a little while longer. And yeah, you had not gotten to the bank at one point with 2 or 3 issues worth of checks. The horrific truth about it is just like cash flow. Hell, it was successful on the surface, but it's what you write about at the end of the book, Ross. There was really no plan. It's naivety. It's youthful enthusiasm. Everything that was great about jamming was also its downfall. And interest rates, people forget that in the 80s, interest rates were like 15 to 20%, which was great if you were a millionaire. But if you're like, if a bank's loaning you money to do a magazine, you just turn around and every single month, your debt's gone up, another few percent. And you're trying to borrow more because you need to get another issue out. And, your mum's put her house down as collateral. And then one day the whole thing comes tumbling down. And it's like, holy, it was really bad. And so, we were always trying to pay the writers something. And I did feel that we had a team spirit going, particularly in that period that we're talking about here with the four of us, sort of issues. It's really issues 15 to 32. It's a mainstay of a fanzine that turned into a magazine. I felt that there was a team spirit. And what I'm getting from you guys is that, yeah, there was a team spirit. Yeah,
definitely.
I was just going to say, if the money had been important, I would have banked the checks more quickly. So, I mean, yes, it was nice to get your foot in the door with journalism and particularly music journalism. But at the same time, you know, it was a sort of a bond. You know, we got to know each other. You know, it's hard being freelance because you don't often come into the office. But I think things like that, because I had to bring the sleeves in. Well, also in those days, you had to come into the office to bring the copy in. You couldn't even get a fax machine in those days. I don't know, Ross, how did you deliver copy? Did you post it? How did you get copy to Jamming when you wrote articles?
I think I must have mailed it in.
Yeah.
I mean, going off on a slight tangent, I started to do live reviews for the NME, and they would always want the copy the very next morning. And I remember there was a way you could walk down to Lime Street Station and you could put an envelope on the train to London and get it collected at the other end. And I think you'd get paid like 20 quid for a review, but it cost you 12 quid to get it to the paper.
Yeah, I had the same thing. I used to write for The Listener, the BBC magazine, The Listener. And because they needed it quickly, I'd have to get a bus all the way across London. And sometimes I think it's taken me longer to deliver it than it took me to write it.
Yeah, it's very true. What about for you, Paul?
Picking up on something that was said earlier about the access and the difference between being in London and being outside of London, is I don't think I got to meet you until very late on. And it might have even been the interview for the full-timers job, because it was just telephone conversations, or I'd phone you from a phone box and ask you stuff about the next assignment, putting a 10p in, and the pips were going, and you'd say something. I'd say, "Well, I didn't catch that. I put the 10p in," and that's the way you did business, you know. And it was just quite fun looking back and thinking about that. Really,
it touches on something that I don't want to let go particularly. Let the interview finish without touching on. Ross, you being from Liverpool, and Paul, you being from Cardiff. For me, running Jamming, yeah, sure, we were based in London. At that point, I thought London was the centre of the world. But I was always keen to have writers who were based somewhere else. And, you know, that mattered to me. Obviously, it meant that you had to mail your copy, which just meant your deadlines were even earlier. But did you feel that there was a sense in terms of with Jamming that we weren't trying to be too London-centric, that we'd be willing to listen to what ideas you had about, you know, bands and things happening in other places where you came from, Liverpool, whatever? I mean, Paul, funny enough, you're not the one from Liverpool, but you wrote a little piece about the High Five and the Farm as a little, you know, up and coming Liverpool bands, right?
Yeah, I remember that very well, because and it also touches on something we talked about earlier about the political edge that Jamming had as well, because it was in the heart of the miners' strike, and Liverpool is a strong left-wing city, as you know, and they had a big benefit from the miners, and that's where I met up with the High Five and the Farm. And yeah, I think it was important to shine a light on the provinces, and because it's not just about London, is it? And as much as a thrill it was to come to do those day trips to London, get the train down and meet people, it was also good. You know, I did a thing with the Faith Brothers where, not quite as glamorous as Bruce's, it was just Bristol to Cardiff rather than a 5-day European tour. So I live in Cardiff anyway, so it wasn't much of a trek, but that was still good fun, you know. And it's like being on the road with the band was a great laugh. But
not forgetting that Jamming did, was it 2 supplements that came, one on Liverpool and was the other one Glasgow?
Yeah, it was Glasgow, yeah.
I definitely felt that you took the rest of the country seriously.
Yeah, and you actually, being based in Liverpool, there is this great story that, can you elaborate on this? How did it come about that you were in hospital? and a publicist was obviously so keen for a band to get into Jamming that they brought the band to you to interview them in a hospital rather than let the interview get postponed. What was that story? It's
a long story, but it was the Pale Fountains, which is ironic because I lived in Liverpool, now from Liverpool. I was in hospital at Guy's Hospital in London. But I wasn't sick. It was what's known as a drug trial, where you'd go in and you get paid to have drugs tested on you. But I think I got £900 for
wow.
the drug trial. So that was like winning the lottery. But But yeah, the Virgin press office tracked me down, and the band all came in with grapes, and I'm lying in bed with a drip in my arm.
It's pretty amusing, actually, the fact that you were in London. Yeah, like you're saying, it was a Liverpool band, and you were based in Liverpool. But when I went back and saw that, going through and putting the book together, it was like, wow, did it matter that much to the record companies? Was our credibility that important? And I guess the answer is yes.
I always felt that the record companies treated jamming very well. I'm particularly looking back, they didn't treat jamming as a sort of fanzine. I think that they took it seriously.
I definitely got that impression as well. There didn't seem to be a hierarchy of, where jamming was somewhere in the middle at the bottom. I think they understood the importance of it. It was a grassroots magazine, but had a lot of readers,
And also the readers were avid readers. They would go out and buy records. I mean, that's what you want, isn't it? It's the age-old thing. Would you soon have a dedicated or small audience that buys, if you're a band that buys your records, or you plays to bigger audiences that doesn't. And I should also point out, so this hasn't come across in any previous episodes, a lot of the publicists were, and a lot of them remain, great people. They're in it for the same reason. They love music, and some of them find that they're good at being publicists, and they're the conduits. They're the ones who open the minibar door for you. They're the conduits who tip you off to the good new bands, tell you that, look, I mean it this time. This group is great. You've got to come see them. Make sure that you're there. I promise I'm not wasting your time. And you would learn to trust some of these people, and they would also become your friends. Paul, you talked about, and this will bring us to the end of jamming, and the fact that I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure that any of you wrote beyond issue 32. At that point, it's ridiculous. I was only 21, but I was kind of like moving upstairs or something. And John was going to become the editor, and we were going to appoint a full-time assistant editor. And so, Paul, you almost got the job. You came down for an interview, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was really disappointed not to get it, to be honest. But that's the way the cookie crumbles, etc. But yeah, it was. I got on very well with both yourself and John, and it was a good experience getting that interview. But didn't pan out. I mean, I did feel slightly better when I was reading that it was kind of John's mate who got the job. So then I thought, well, maybe that's what happened then. But I don't know.
It was. And Paul Mather, I did get to see him a couple of times in the 90s. And so we were able to have conversations. But it seems to me that once John and Paul were editing from that issue 33 for the 4 issues it lasted, that the 3 of you were suddenly not writing for the magazine.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. Looking back, I've got all of the copies until the very end, pretty much. Well, from the time I started writing, from 15 onwards, and I had nothing after the Robert Smith interview, and I couldn't quite figure out why that was. But it kind of did go in a slightly different direction, I think, towards the end, and not just the way it looked. It's difficult to put your finger on it, really. Because when I was going through all the jamming stuff, as you do in the loft, I came across some old diaries, and it just happened to be one from the day that John Wilde rang me up and said that jamming had folded, and thinking, and it brought it all back to me and how gutted I was about it. It came back into focus very quickly.
That's very interesting that you got a call to say it had folded, but after delivering a great cover story for us for Robert Smith, you actually never got to write for the magazine again, even though it continued for 4 more issues.
I know. What's that all about?
That's strange. Bruce, were you, same story, really? You were writing for us constantly and then suddenly not writing for us. Was that out of choice? Was it just, and the same with you, Ross. I want to ask that question of the both of you.
Yeah, I think I pretty much know what happened for me. Paul Mather and we both applied for the job at Jamming, which Paul got. I don't know if I was second choice or third choice or whatever, but Paul got the job at Jamming. And Paul and I also both applied. I don't know if you know this. We both applied for the job of music editor at City Limits. And I got that job. That was the job I got. So I missed out on the Jamming job, which I'd have loved to have had. I didn't decide not to write for Jamming, and I got on very well with John. John I'd known for years. So I'm sure they'd have had me. I think I just had my hands full with a full-time job for the first time in my life. And I have to say again, I wouldn't have got the job at City Limits if I hadn't had by then I had a nice big pile of cuttings from jamming, which I could show them. And I'm sure that helped me land that job.
And then for you, Ross, you're also maybe somewhere around Gil Scott Heron as one of your last big pieces. Do you remember what happened with you?
I don't, and I was slightly surprised looking back that I didn't contribute for those last issues. But it did feel like something had changed. It felt different, and I think I always got on well with yourself and with Tiny and with Alan McLaughlin, and I never felt I was always kind of intimidated by John Wilde. We were talking earlier about how the fanzine was kind of welcoming and felt like open, but by the end it didn't. It felt kind of closed, and it felt like it was closed to me. I mean, I'll kind of ask you a question. If you'd have written out those times, do you think you'd have stuck with it year after year after year, or you think you would have kind of got out anyway?
I think it lasted its period, and I really appreciated what both of you wrote for the book. I know, Paul, you would have written some lovely things as well. I almost gave you the last word in the book, Ross, because I think you nailed it about just, the fact that nobody knows what they're doing. I mean, that's the beauty. Once you sort of start knowing what you're doing, you start second guessing yourself. And I'm not sure that Jamming was those last 4 issues are the closest it comes to being a professional magazine. And for my money, they're not the 4 most interesting issues. So I think the interesting stuff is still where we're still printing pages wrong. There's some terrible designs. People are going uncredited, all that kind of stuff. But there's that fire in those issues. There's that fire in the interviews that I think makes it a better magazine. So maybe I just wasn't cut out for editing a stable monthly magazine. Maybe that just wasn't in my DNA.
I mean, I think in hindsight, Jamming had a kind of perfect trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, it makes for a good book, doesn't it? At this point, all these years down the line, it's like almost exactly 10 years, and you can see the trajectory. Let's just take a final moment to just circle around on what you've all done. You just vaguely touched on it at the beginning.
I went from writing about music full time to writing about TV and particularly live comedy. And I know, quite a lot, because there was that thing of comedy being the new rock and roll. I think it was funny with writing about comedy when there was that big boom in London, because I think a few music journalists went into it. And I think partly because maybe that had the same sort of spirit, if you want to call it an anarchic or an alternative spirit, comedy had the same spirit. But I also think maybe when I was getting into my sort of 30s or mid-30s, the thing that comedy had over music was you could sit down at the gigs. And I think I was getting to the age that getting fed up, getting a bad back or something, getting a bit deaf, standing at gigs. So I'll still go to gigs, but they tend to be the ones you can sit down at. But yeah, the comedy gigs, a comedy club, whether it was in a pub or in a theatre, you'd be sitting down at them. So I look back really fondly on my time with jamming and writing about music in general. But it's one of those, it's a bit like the way, the guy that is the lead singer of the Stranglers now has been the lead singer of the Stranglers a lot longer than Hugh Cornwall ever was. But we always think of Hugh Cornwall as being the lead singer of the Stranglers, I'm sure. And it's a bit like me. I like to think of myself as a music journalist, but in fact, I've been writing about comedy and television a lot longer than I wrote about music. It was just such it's that thing about being in your 20s and your early 20s. It's such an exciting time that it kind of stays with you forever. And that's why I wanted to sort of take part in this, to sort of relive it a bit and think about it a bit.
For yourself, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, apart from anything else, that the achievements of Jamming the magazine as an ethos and what it stood for, I think for a lot of people it provided a platform to do other things. And for me, it was the portfolio of work I did for Jamming got me a job with Q magazine, and I wrote for Q for a decade after that. So that was really enjoyable. It's like one of those things, as a freelancer, you're often dependent upon your relationship with the reviews editor, aren't you? And sometimes that doesn't go that well. And I kind of fizzled out at the end with Q and not doing so much writing anymore, just some various projects. But I got into IT as a career and, I had a young family. So there was like a lot of different calls on my time, so there was less time for the journalism then. Now I'm retired and going down the allotment every other day. So yeah, cool.
Ross, do you ever still write about music? Do you at least do you ever write about the bands that play at your bar?
I'm writing a book called Tales from the Phoenix Saloon, So yes, I do. I couldn't not write.
Good. Does that mean you've been maintaining it over the years, of still just if only for yourself at certain times?
Definitely. I've kind of been working on sort of 3 books, which may be 1 book in the end. I don't know, but you get a thank you in the acknowledgements.
Oh, on us. So that's wonderful. Thank you. I want to say about the 3 of you that, we built up a team of reliable people, and the unreliable ones, went by the wayside. There weren't too many, and maybe I don't know if I want to take any credit for seeing something in each of you, but you were all green lighted, and you were all very, very reliable. The copy arrived, and whether it was by mail or hand delivered off of a train, the copy arrived. The pieces were great. We covered a lot of interesting ground together. Looking back on it, the 3 of you, along with a couple of other people I haven't been able to track down, and a couple of others I have, were really the mainstay of a point when we put out the most words, for the longest time. And you all played an extremely important role in that. There's some really solid pieces from you. And so if there was a success to jamming, everybody played a part, and the 3 of you all played your own part in it. So thank you.
Thank you.
As always, as ever, thank you to my guests for the great conversation. And as always, and as ever, I hope you, the listener, got something from it. I feel compelled to mention that in the most recent New Year's Honours list in the UK this past January, i.e. just the past couple of weeks, Pauline Black received an OBE. And I'm sure that more than makes up for the fact that we were too dumb and stupid and naive, to paraphrase Ross Fortune, to put her name on the cover of Jamming 17. Somebody else that was mentioned there who already had a New Year's Honours list to their name is Mike Peters. Mike Peters from The Alarm is an MBE, and that's for his work with music charities, cancer charities, and probably a good chance there for me to plug the other podcasts I had running through 2020 and 2021. One Step Beyond. I had a great interview with Mike about not so much his music, but about the incredible life story he's had with cancer, and the charities that he's set up, and some of the events he's put on to raise money for cancer treatments in areas, parts of the world that couldn't otherwise afford it. So there will be a link to that in the show notes. Similarly, we've had Alan McGee on this podcast already. We were talking about Creation Records. And yeah, spin back, and if you haven't already, and listened to the first 7 episodes, for my money, they've all been good fun. I mentioned up front that we have some book events coming up. The book, of course, is The Best of Jamming, Selections and Stories from the Fanzine that Grew Up, 1977 to 86. It's published by Omnibus Press. It's in full colour. I'm thrilled with how it came out. It feels like one bumper annual sort of fanzine, like the kind of annuals that you would have gotten in your Christmas stocking. And I do know a lot of people who actually got this book as some kind of Christmas present. So I hope they're all enjoying it and reliving their days when it would have been a Beano annual or a shoot annual instead. Yeah, we're really, really happy with the book, and I'd always wanted to do some events to promote it. We couldn't really do them at the end of 2021, and indeed we have had to postpone one at the start of 2022 in New York City. It was due to take place January the 18th, but out of COVID caution, myself and my co-host John Schaefer from WNYC have decided to put it off for now. Hopefully we can reschedule it once I am back from the UK. I am fully intending to be in the UK from the second half of February, when we have 3 events in 3 nights, which is very rock and roll. And suitably, the first of them is actually at the Rock and Roll Book Club at the Dublin Castle in Camden Town in London on Wednesday, February 23rd. The next day, I'm going down to Brighton, which is a place I also dearly love, and taking part in an event hosted by City Books there, which is being held at the Rialto Theatre. I'm in conversation with the Arts Desk editor, Caspar Gomez, but I'm particularly thrilled that I am going to be joined by Guy Pratt as a special guest. Guy, if you don't know him, spin back to episode 2 of this podcast. He is also, among many other things as a musician, a host of a way more successful podcast than this called Rock on Tours. So that's Thursday, Feb 24th. And the next night, I'm popping down the south coast, or along the south coast, to Bexhill, where we are going to take over the Electric Palace Cinema and screen the movie Rough Cut and Ready Dubbed, which is an amazing street-level look at the post-punk scene that Jamming covered. Very rarely seen movie. I had not seen it until we started planning this event. I strongly recommend you come along, not least because it will be followed by a conversation hosted by DJ Wendy May, who was in the most recent podcast. You can find a lot more information on these events by going to tonyfletcher.net or on Facebook, The Tony Fletcher. And again, show notes for further info. I'm going to just give you some shout outs here to Greg Morton over at Omnibus for all his wonderful work on this podcast. I honestly would not be doing it if it was just me. I want to thank my son, Noel Fletcher, for the fantastic Jamming Fanzine podcast theme music that he put together at very short notice and very professionally. Episode 9 will feature Brian Young from the band Rudy and Jaffo from the band Zeitgeist, along with the group Apocalypse. These were the 3 bands on the Jamming Records label, which was an offshoot of the Jamming Fanzine back in 1981 and 82. Take care until then. Cheers!